In 1917, the United States had more than 45,000 miles of electric streetcar track running through its cities, quietly moving millions of people every single day without a single drop of gasoline. You did not need a driver's license to participate in urban life. You needed a nickel. For 5 cents, a factory worker could ride from a narrow apartment on the edge of town to a steel mill downtown. A secretary could cross the city before sunrise, and a shop owner could depend on customers arriving like clockwork because the rail line outside never failed to show up. At its peak, Americans took more than 10 billion streetcar rides a year, and these systems were not charity projects or government experiments. They were private companies that operated for decades and paid steady returns to investors who believed in them. Entire neighborhoods were built around those tracks. Real estate ads proudly listed the nearest line, and families chose where to live based on walking distance to a stop, not proximity to a parking garage. Then, in the span of a single generation, the rails were torn out, the wires were cut down, and the cars that once defined American streets were hauled away for scrap. Today, we are told that owning a car is unavoidable, that modern cities simply cannot function without personal vehicles. But for more than 50 years, they did exactly that. So this story does not begin with failure. It begins with disappearance. If you want to understand what was lost, you have to understand how well it actually worked. Because streetcars were not a fragile experiment, they were a highly efficient machine woven into the daily rhythm of American life. Unlike a gasoline bus or a private automobile, a streetcar drew power directly from an overhead electric line, which meant no onboard fuel tank, no combustion engine vibrating under the floor, and no daily dependency on oil deliveries to keep the city moving. Electric motors are brutally simple compared to internal combustion engines, with fewer moving parts, less heat, and far less mechanical stress, which translated into vehicles that could run for decades with proper maintenance, instead of wearing themselves out in a few short years. The steel rails beneath them were not temporary pavement markings. They were fixed infrastructure that often lasted 40, 50, even 70 years before needing full replacement, spreading construction costs across generations of riders instead of forcing constant repaving and expansion. One streetcar could carry dozens of passengers at once, and during peak hours, cities coupled multiple cars together into trains, moving the equivalent of entire lines of automobiles through a single narrow corridor without traffic lights, without gridlock, and without the chaos of thousands of individual drivers competing for space. At their height in the mid-1910s, Americans were taking more than 10 billion streetcar trips per year, a number that dwarfed early automobile usage and reflected a system that was not just surviving, but dominating urban transportation. These were not empty cars rattling down abandoned tracks. They were packed during rush hour, reliable enough that factory shift times and office schedules were synchronized to their arrival, predictable enough that a worker could plan his life around the timetable posted at the stop. Financially, many of these systems were structured as private utilities, funded by investors who expected returns and, for decades, received them, because fair revenue covered operating costs and in many cases produced steady dividends that made street railway stocks attractive holdings in local markets. The 5-cent fare that became iconic was not originally a gimmick. It was a competitive price point that encouraged volume, and volume was massive, creating a steady stream of small payments that added up to enormous annual revenue. Streetcar companies did not just collect fares, they often purchased land at the edge of existing development, laid track out to that land, and then sold residential lots at a premium once reliable transportation made those neighborhoods viable, effectively creating value by connecting distance to opportunity. This model helped create what historians later called the streetcar suburb, communities that were quiet enough to escape industrial noise, but close enough to downtown that a 20-minute ride could replace an exhausting daily walk. Before the mass adoption of private automobiles, these rail lines defined how cities expanded, with growth radiating outward along tracks like spokes on a wheel, concentrating commerce and housing around fixed stops instead of scattering them across miles of pavement. From an engineering standpoint, fixed rail had another advantage. It created certainty, because developers, shop owners, and families knew the line could not simply drift away tomorrow. It was bolted into the street, and powered by a grid that the entire city depended on. Compare that to the flexibility of buses and cars, which can be rerouted, abandoned, or rendered useless by fuel shortages, and you begin to see why rail was seen not as a relic, but as the backbone of urban mobility. Streetcars were quiet compared to early automobiles. They produced no tailpipe fumes at street level, and they reduced the need for vast parking lots that would later swallow blocks of valuable land just to store idle machines. They were not perfect, no system ever is, but by the standards of their time, they were efficient, profitable, scalable, and deeply integrated into the economic fabric of American cities. This was not a dying technology clinging to relevance. It was a system that had already proven it could move a nation. By the early 20th century, streetcars were not a novelty confined to a handful of dense coastal cities. They were a national standard, embedded in more than 1,000 American communities, from sprawling industrial hubs to modest regional towns. Estimates suggest that over 1,200 street railway systems operated across the United States at their peak, creating a web of electric lines that stitched together the daily movement of a rapidly urbanizing population. In cities like Los Angeles, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, the streetcar was not one transportation option among many. It was the transportation system, carrying the overwhelming majority of commuters to factories, offices, markets, and schools. Downtown business districts were designed around predictable waves of riders arriving by rail, and entire commercial corridors thrived because foot traffic flowed directly from fixed stops positioned only steps from storefront doors. The dominance of streetcars also shaped housing patterns, as developers strategically extended lines into undeveloped land, then marketed new homes with promises of fast, affordable rides into the city center, effectively turning transportation access into a selling point that fueled explosive suburban growth. This integration of transit and real estate created a powerful feedback loop, where more riders justified more lines, and more lines unlocked more land, reinforcing the system's scale and normalizing rail-based mobility as the default way urban America functioned. By the mid-1910s, it was common for residents of major cities to rely almost entirely on streetcars for work, shopping, and social life, structuring their routines around timetables rather than ignition keys. Streetcars were not peripheral infrastructure. They were the rails upon which American urban life ran. But a system built on durable steel and steady fares posed a quiet problem for a new generation of industrial giants whose profits depended not on permanence, but on constant consumption. A streetcar line, once installed, did not need to be replaced every few years. It did not burn fuel at the point of use, and it did not require each individual rider to purchase a separate machine, which meant fewer repeat sales and fewer opportunities to monetize every mile traveled. An electric rail network generated revenue primarily through fares, modest payments spread across millions of passengers, while the emerging automobile industry operated on a different logic entirely, selling a complex product filled with parts that wore down, fluids that had to be replaced, and tires that degraded with every turn of the wheel. Companies like General Motors were not simply selling transportation, they were building an ecosystem of recurring purchases, from replacement components to dealer servicing networks that captured revenue long after the initial sale. Oil producers such as Standard Oil of California depended on a world where movement required daily fuel consumption, and tire manufacturers like Firestone Tire and Rubber Company thrived in an economy where rubber met asphalt thousands of times per mile. A fixed electric rail line, powered by a centralized grid and capable of lasting generations, limited that cycle of replacement and consumption, because one set of tracks could serve an entire corridor without forcing each household to buy and maintain its own vehicle. From a purely financial perspective, rail represented stability, but automobiles represented multiplication, as every new driver meant another engine, another tank of fuel, another set of tires wearing thin on concrete. The threat was not ideological, it was structural, because a city organized around shared rail transit constrained the scale of individual vehicle ownership, and therefore constrained the total market for cars, gasoline, and parts. In that sense, streetcars were not just moving people. They were capping growth for an industry built on selling more, to more people, more often. The shift did not happen overnight, and it did not begin with bulldozers ripping up tracks. It began with ownership, quietly changing hands as struggling rail systems, weakened by fare freezes and rising costs, became acquisition targets rather than untouchable utilities. In 1936, a holding company called National City Lines began purchasing controlling interests in local transit operators, presenting itself not as a destroyer of public transportation, but as a modernizer promising efficiency and streamlined management. Behind National City Lines stood financial backing from firms whose core businesses aligned perfectly with rubber tires and internal combustion engines, including General Motors, Standard Oil of California, and Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, companies that did not manufacture rails, overhead wires, or electric substations. The pattern repeated across multiple cities, as transit systems in places like Los Angeles, Baltimore, St. Louis, and Oakland were gradually brought under the control of entities connected to this network, with promises of modernization that often translated into replacing electric streetcars with motor buses. Once control was secured, conversion followed a clear logic. Tracks were removed, overhead power lines were dismantled, and fleets of new buses manufactured by General Motors were introduced to run on gasoline, supplied through agreements that benefited oil interests, riding on tires produced by Firestone. This transformation was framed as progress. Buses were advertised as flexible, able to change routes without expensive rail construction, and marketed as symbols of a forward-looking America that embraced mobility over fixed pathways. But flexibility had a cost, because buses required constant fuel purchases, more frequent vehicle replacement, and ongoing parts consumption, turning what had been a relatively stable infrastructure expense into a recurring revenue stream tied directly to vehicle sales and petroleum use. The process was not uniform across every city, and not every rail line was acquired by National City Lines. Yet the broader trend was unmistakable, as hundreds of streetcar systems either converted to buses or shut down entirely between the late 1930s and the 1950s. In 1947, the federal government indicted National City Lines and several of its corporate backers under antitrust laws, alleging that they had conspired to monopolize the sale of buses, fuel, and related supplies to the transit companies they controlled. The case, United States versus National City Lines, culminated in 1949 with convictions on charges related to monopolizing the supply of buses and equipment, though the defendants were acquitted on broader allegations of conspiring to monopolize transit systems themselves. The penalties were modest, with corporate fines that amounted to a few $1,000s, and individual fines so small they barely registered against the balance sheets of the companies involved, leaving critics to argue that the legal outcome acknowledged coordination without fundamentally altering the trajectory already underway. By the time the verdict was handed down, many conversions had already taken place. Rails had been removed, maintenance facilities retooled for buses, and riders accustomed to electric cars found themselves boarding vehicles that burned fuel and shared lanes with increasing automobile traffic. Yet corporate acquisitions and equipment contracts were only part of the story, because federal policy soon reinforced the shift in ways that rail operators could not easily counter. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, launching a massive program to build over 40,000 miles of interstate highways, funded largely by federal dollars covering the overwhelming majority of construction costs. Highways were not inherently anti-transit, but the scale of investment tilted the playing field, channeling public funds into roads designed primarily for automobiles, while urban rail systems, many still privately owned and financially strained, received no comparable infusion of capital. As suburban development accelerated along these new highways, cities sprawled outward in patterns that favored personal vehicle ownership, making fixed rail lines appear less adaptable in landscapes increasingly defined by cul-de-sacs and parking lots. Local governments often faced decisions about whether to invest scarce resources in maintaining aging rail infrastructure or to embrace buses that could operate on the expanding road network without dedicated tracks. And in many cases, the short-term financial calculation favored the latter. What emerged was not a single dramatic act of destruction, but a layered process in which private acquisitions, Equipment supply agreements, legal judgments, and federal highway subsidies converged to reshape urban transportation around rubber tires and gasoline. Streetcars were not outlawed nationwide, nor were they erased in a single coordinated strike. But the combined incentives of corporate profit models and public infrastructure spending created an environment where rail was systematically displaced by systems that generated more frequent and diversified revenue streams. By the early 1960s, once dense webs of electric lines had largely vanished from American streets, replaced by buses navigating traffic and a rapidly growing population of privately owned cars filling the roads that federal policy had helped build. The erasure did not look like sabotage in a dark alley. It looked like modernization, efficiency, and growth. Yet beneath those labels lay a fundamental shift from shared, durable infrastructure to individualized, consumption-driven mobility. The tracks did not disappear by accident. They were removed in a climate where doing so made financial sense for the companies selling what came next. By the time the last major streetcar lines were dismantled in many American cities, the cultural shift was already complete, and owning a private automobile had transformed from a convenience into an expectation woven into the fabric of everyday life. Today, more than 90% of American households have access to at least one vehicle, and in many regions a single car is not enough because work, school, and basic errands are separated by distances that assume individual motorized travel. The average cost of owning and operating a vehicle now runs into thousands of dollars per year when fuel, insurance, maintenance, financing, and depreciation are combined, turning mobility into one of the largest recurring expenses for the modern household. For families living paycheck to paycheck, a mechanical failure is not just an inconvenience, it is a financial emergency, because without a functioning car, access to employment and essential services can collapse overnight. Urban design followed the logic of highways and parking lots, spreading homes, offices, and shopping centers across vast areas where walking is impractical, and fixed rail becomes expensive to reintroduce after the fact. The result is a built environment that quietly assumes car ownership as a prerequisite for participation, locking residents into a cycle of payments that echoes the recurring revenue model that once made buses and automobiles so attractive to their manufacturers. In cities that retained or rebuilt robust rail networks, particularly in parts of Europe and Asia, residents often have the option to forego private vehicles entirely, highlighting that the American model was not the only possible outcome. When rail disappeared, dependency appeared, and what had once been a shared public corridor became a series of individual financial obligations rolling down federally funded roads. In recent decades, a quiet reversal has begun in several American cities, as planners and voters have approved billions of dollars to build new light rail lines in places like Los Angeles, Dallas, and Portland, attempting to reconstruct fragments of a network that once existed at a fraction of today's cost. These modern systems are often praised as innovative solutions to congestion and climate concerns, yet their very necessity raises an uncomfortable question about why the original electric networks were allowed to vanish in the first place. Constructing new rail corridors now requires complex environmental reviews, land acquisition battles, utility relocations, and enormous public funding commitments, all to recreate infrastructure that earlier generations had already laid down and operated for decades. The irony is difficult to ignore, because cities are spending vast sums to solve mobility problems that were once addressed by steel tracks embedded in ordinary streets. The tracks were removed, the wires were cut, and the cars were scrapped. But the core idea never disappeared. A city can move people efficiently without requiring every adult to finance a machine. The only real question left is why that lesson had to be learned twice.